In the winter of 1887, we worked a white pine cut outside Wexford County, Michigan 6 days a week from first light until the cold drove the saw teeth stiff. I was hired on as a sawyer, paid by the month, and housed in a rough shanty near a cedar swamp that never seemed to finish freezing clean. At first, it was only the usual things a man expects in deep winter: wind that cut the lips, snow that swallowed sound, and dark that came early and stayed. Then the signs started showing up where no man had reason to be: tracks too long for a wolf, set too deep at the front, spaced like something that walked upright when it pleased. At night, a call carried through the trees that sounded like two voices sharing one throat. And when the men began to vanish quietly, without a shout, none of us could pretend it was just the woods anymore. Before we go on, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. I hired on in late November, when the frost had already hardened the ground and the tote roads rang under iron shoes. The company paid $20 a month with board, same as most winter cuts, and issued a bunk, rough blankets, and a share of the stove. I'd worked camps before up north, farther west, but this one sat lower, close to a cedar swamp that stayed dark even at midday. The timber was good white pine and hemlock, tall and straight, and the landing lay a few miles off the main road, far enough that you felt the distance once the snow set in. The shanty went up in 2 days. Rough plank walls, a high roof to carry smoke, and a single iron stove set near the center. The bunks were stacked along the walls, straw ticks laid over saplings. Boots stayed by the stove at night to keep from freezing stiff. The cookhouse sat a short walk away, tied to the door with a rope so no one lost the path in blowing snow. We stacked wood inside after the first week. When the cold started biting harder, our foreman was a man named Harlan Pike. He wasn't loud, didn't curse much, and kept order by standing where trouble might start. No liquor, no cards after 10, no wandering off the line. He docked pay for broken handles if they came from carelessness, and he paired men who worked steady together. I was set on a 6-foot crosscut with Tom Voss, a strong-backed man who talked more than he needed to. He pulled hard and fast, sometimes too fast, but he knew his cut. Eli Sturgis bunked near the stove. He was older than most of us, quiet, and kept a small Bible folded in his shirt cloth. Baptist was our best riverman, short, quick, with a scar along his jaw and hands that moved without waste. Eeyore drove the oxen. He spoke to them low and steady and knew their moods better than most men know each other. Silas Shaw arranged the trap lines and brought in meat when the salt pork turned blue at the edges. Jude was the youngest, lean and eager, new to a full winter cut and trying not to show it. We worked from first light. The cold air cut the mouth and made every breath sting. Axes rang clean. The saw teeth sang when the cut went true. At noon we ate bread and pork with crusts hard enough to fight the teeth. Washed down with coffee that tasted of iron, the snow carried us well over frozen hummocks. And the trees came down clean when the wedges cracked through. By the second week, the landing stacked meat, and Pike said we'd make quota if no thaw came on too fast. Nights settled early. The wind moved through the spruce tops and died in the cedar. The swamp held a stillness that pressed on the ears, like sound had been taken away rather than lost. Men talked less after dark, not from fear, but from the way the quiet seemed to listen back. There was nothing wrong yet. No trouble a man could point to. Just the work, the cold, and the woods closing in around us, steady and patient, as if they had all the time in the world. Trouble didn't arrive all at once. It came in small pieces that a man could explain away if you wanted to. The first sign showed up along Silas Shaw's trap line, 2 weeks into the cut, on a morning when the snow lay smooth and clear as paper. He came back to camp before noon, slower than usual, and stood near the stove without taking off his gloves. When Pike asked what held him up, Silas said he'd found a deer in the cedar run that hadn't died the way deer usually do. A few of us went back with him after the meal. The carcass hung partway off the ground, caught in a low branch as if it had been set there and forgotten. The ribs were split open, but not clean. Meat had been torn away in strips, not chewed down. The snow beneath was packed hard, scuffed smooth in places, and marked with a set of prints that didn't sit right to my eye. They were longer than a wolf's, deeper at the front, and spaced farther apart than they should have been. There were no clear claw points, just pressure lines pressed into the crust. Silas crouched and studied them without speaking for a long moment. He'd trapped most of his life and knew sign the way some men know handwriting. Finally, he shook his head once and said, quiet enough that only those nearest heard him, "This isn't right." He pointed out the stride, the way the weight seemed to shift forward. He didn't name what he thought it was, and no one asked him to. Pike said it was a bear that hadn't settled proper for winter. He said a half-starved bear would do strange things, rise up, drag a kill, leave odd tracks. He told us not to read more into it than there was. The company didn't pay us to chase stories. We hauled the deer off the line and left it for scavengers, then went back to work. The saw ran the same as it always had. Trees came down true. Men fell back into rhythm. Still, I caught myself watching the tree line more than I needed to. The woods felt closer somehow, like the space between trunks had tightened. When I stepped where the prints had been, I noticed how deep they'd cut through the crust, deeper than mine did even with a full pack. No one spoke of it that night. The foreman's word held, and there was no proof a man could carry in his hands. But when the light went and the swamp went quiet again, I found myself listening harder than before, waiting for something I couldn't yet name. The first sound came on a night so still the stove ticking carried clear across the shanty. The wind had backed off after dusk, and the swamp lay quiet in a way that felt finished, as if nothing else would move until morning. We lay in our bunks with our boots drying by the stove, breath rising and falling slow in the dark. Somewhere beyond the cedar line, a call lifted out of the low ground. It wasn't loud. That was what made it worse. It held a long-drawn note, and under it ran a second sound, rougher and lower, both moving together as if one throat were forcing two voices at once. The sound slid through the trees and settled into the rafters, filling the space above us. A few men pushed up on their elbows. Voss laughed once and said a sick wolf had found its voice. Someone else said it might be a bull moose calling late. Eli didn't speak. I heard the faint rustle of his blankets and knew he was awake. The call came again, closer this time, then trailed off toward the swamp as if whatever made it had decided against coming nearer. We had a camp dog, a brindled cur we called Blue, tied near the cookhouse. He started whining as soon as the sound rose, a thin, nervous noise that didn't stop until Nels kicked the floorboards and told him to hush. Even then, Blue kept his head low and his tail tucked, pulling against the rope until it strained. No one went outside to look. There was nothing to see, and Pike didn't stir from his bunk. The sound passed, leaving the quiet behind it thicker than before. Men lay back down, some muttering, some crossing themselves, some pretending sleep had already taken them. I stayed awake longer than I meant to, counting breaths until they evened out around me. When I finally slipped under, I dreamed of footsteps moving along the roofline, slow and measured, testing the beams before lifting away. I woke before dawn with my jaw clenched and the taste of iron in my mouth. By morning, there was no sign of anything amiss. The snow lay clean. The forest stood as it always had. Whatever made the sound had left nothing a man could point to, and so we went back to work. The days that followed settled into a pattern that none of us spoke about outright, but all of us felt. The sound came again the next night, and the night after that. Always after dark. Sometimes it rose from the swamp, sometimes from the higher timber, and sometimes it seemed to move while it called, slipping closer and then farther off as if testing distance. It never sounded the same twice, but it always carried that doubled quality, one voice riding beneath another. By the third night, Blue refused to settle. He whined until his throat went hoarse and scratched at the cookhouse door hard enough to leave pale lines in the planks. Nels cursed at him and tightened the rope, but the dog kept his head low and his ears flat, staring into the dark whenever the sound passed. Silas came back from his line with 2 traps, bent so badly they'd need a hammer to set right. He said he'd staked them clean and tight, and the chains had cut grooves in the saplings from the strain. The bait was gone, but there were no tooth marks where there should have been, no torn flesh caught in the jaws. Pike told him he'd set them wrong and sent him back out the next day with a warning not to waste company iron. Near the cedar edge, a smell started to hang in the air. It wasn't rot and it wasn't wet dog. It was sharp and old, like hide left too long near a fire. It turned the stomach in a small way, not enough to make a man sick, but enough that you noticed it each time you passed. No one mentioned it aloud. On the 5th morning, Blue was gone. The rope lay frayed near the post, not cut clean, just worn through as if it had been worked at. In the snow nearby were a few dark drops that had frozen into glassy beads. They led a short distance and then stopped. Voss said the dog had pulled free and taken off after a scent. He grinned when he said it, but the grin didn't reach his eyes. Jude asked if we should look for him. Pike said we had logs to haul and no time to spare for a camp cur. That same evening, we found marks on the outer wall of the shanty near the latch. 4 deep grooves cut clean through the grain, set chest high on a man. The wood curled outward along each line. Pike ran his thumb along one groove and said a porcupine had tested the salt from our hands. No one answered him. After that, men began stacking more wood inside and checking the door bar twice before lying down. Talk fell off at night. Even Voss kept his jokes short. The forest felt closer, pressing in around the light of the camp, and the dark beyond the trees seemed heavier than it had any right to be. Still, no orders came down. No men were pulled off the line. The foreman kept us working, and we did as we were told. There was nothing solid to argue with, only sounds, smells, and signs that slipped away under daylight. And so the days went on, each one carrying the same quiet tension, waiting for the pattern to break into something a man could no longer deny. The first man to see it was Aor, and he wasn't given to stories. He'd been out before first light, checking the sled runners, moving slow along the tote road where it cut between the spruce. When he came back in, his face had lost its color, and he stood with his hands braced on the cookhouse table as if the ground weren't quite steady. He said he'd seen a shape cross the road ahead of him, tall enough that its shoulders cleared the brush without ducking. It moved upright, not in a rush, and when it reached the far side, it turned its head once before slipping into the trees. He told us the arms hung too low for a man, reaching past the hip in a way that didn't fit. He spread his hands to show the width of the shoulders. They shook when he did it. Voss said he'd seen a man in a fur cap. Someone else said the light plays tricks before dawn. Pike listened without comment and then told Eeyore to get some coffee and settle himself. He said fear would put shapes where there were none. The talk died there, but it didn't sit right. At noon, when I passed the place Aor had pointed out, I saw where something had crossed. The snow there was broken through the crust in a single long stride. The impression was deep at the front, light at the back, as if weight had shifted forward and lifted again. It didn't look like a man's track, even shod, and it didn't look like any animal I knew. That evening, Pike walked the perimeter of the camp with Silas and came back with his mouth set flat. He told us to bring more wood inside and to keep the door barred after dark. He didn't say why. When the light went, he set watches in pairs by the door, 2 men up while the rest slept. I took the second turn. The forest beyond the firelight seemed to press in, the dark packed tight between the trunks. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with imagination. I kept my eyes on the tree line and my hands close to the axe handle, and when my watch ended, I was relieved in a way I didn't care to admit. Whatever Aor had seen, I believed him. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew then that what moved through the timber was not just another thing the woods had always held. Silas was the first not to come back. He'd gone out near dusk to check the north line, where the cedar thickened and the ground dropped off into low, wet country. He'd done it 100 times before, sometimes alone, sometimes with Baptist, and he knew how to move that ground without wasting steps. When the light went and he hadn't returned, no one said much at first. Men run late. Traps snag. Snow slows you down. By full dark, Pike sent Baptist out to look for him. He came back near an hour later with his cap in his hand and his breath gone, shaking his head before anyone asked. He said he'd found Silas's trail where it should have been, and then where it WASN single quotes D. We went out with lanterns, 5 of us in a loose line. The snow held sound, and our boots made a thin grind as we moved. We found Silas's prints heading straight for the swamp edge, clean and steady. Then the trail wavered. The steps shortened, turned slightly, as if he'd seen something off to the side and changed his mind. A few yards farther on, his capplate punched into the snow. Beyond it was a smear that ran 4 feet and stopped. The lantern light caught dark stains frozen hard into the crust. No man said the word, but we all knew what it was. Past that point, there were 2 sets of tracks. One was Silas's, shallow now, dragged. The other set came in from the side and set down heavy at the front, far apart, the same wrong shape we'd seen before. They ran together for a short distance, and then Silas's steps ended. Not turned, not broken, just gone. The other tracks continued on alone. The snow packed smooth where weight had pushed through and lifted again. Pike studied the ground without speaking. He straightened at last and said we were going back. Baptist opened his mouth as if to argue, then shut it. On the walk in, something moved through the brush to our left and stopped when we stopped. No sound followed. Back at camp, Pike counted heads twice. He told us no one went out alone again, not for any reason. In the morning, he said we'd searched and found nothing, and that was the end of it. The company didn't pay us to stare at trees. Work resumed at first light. The saw ran. Axes rang. Men kept their eyes on the ground and the branches both. No one spoke Silas's name, but his absence sat heavy among us, a space that would not close. The line had been crossed, and every man there knew it, even if no one said it aloud. The first clear sight of it came 2 nights later, and it lasted no more than a few breaths. I was on watch with Voss, standing just inside the door while the others slept. The fire had burned low, and the lantern by the latch threw a thin, unsteady light across the packed snow outside. The forest beyond sat black and close, the tree line pressed tight against the edge of what little glow we had. We heard the sound before we saw anything slow movement through brush, deliberate, not rushed. Then something blocked the lantern light dot at first. I thought it was a tree trunk swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. The shape stood just beyond the reach of the flame, tall enough that its head rose above where a man's should have been. Voss lifted the lantern without speaking, and the light slid forward. 2 eyes caught it and threw it back. The reflection was flat and pale, not bright like a deer's, and it held steady instead of flinching away. The head beneath them sat wrong on the shoulders, set low, with no clear neck. The arms hung long at its sides, too long, and when it shifted its weight, one of those arms moved forward. The hand that came into the light was not a paw. The fingers spread and closed once, slow and deliberate, joints bending the way a man's. Do only thicker, heavier. I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't move. Neither did Voss. We stood there breathing shallow, afraid that any sudden sound would pull it closer. For a moment, it seemed to study us. Then it stepped back, the movement. Smooth and controlled, and the dark swallowed it. The eyes vanished. The shape melted into the trees without a sound. leaving the space in front of us empty again. We didn't follow. We didn't speak. Voss lowered the lantern with a hand that shook despite his trying to still it. Somewhere in the distance, the doubled call rose once and then fell away. When Pike came to relieve us, he took one look at our faces and set the bar across the door without asking questions. The rest of the night passed without incident, but no one slept deeply. By morning, every man in camp carried the same knowledge, unspoken but certain. Whatever had taken Silas was not something the woods had always held. The decision came at daybreak, spoken plain and without room for argument. Pike stood by the stove with his coat already on and said we were hauling out to the landing. Not finishing the cut, not pushing quota. We would move what we had and work. From open ground or leave the timber altogether if we had to. He didn't name the reason. He didn't need to. No one questioned him. Men rose and began packing as if the order had been expected. Blankets were rolled tight. Tools were checked and stacked. The sleds were brought close. Runners scraped clean of ice. Eeyore hitched the oxen and spoke to them in a low voice, his hand steady on their necks. The animals shifted and rolled their eyes, uneasy in a way that made my own skin prickle. The camp felt smaller as we worked. The walls closer, the dark outside thicker than it had any right to be in full morning light. Conversation dropped off. Entirely. Even the usual curses and small talk vanished, replaced by the sound of canvas being folded and iron knocking against wood. As we loaded the last of the supplies, I had the sense that we were being measured. Not watched in the way a man watches another man, but observed, weighed, as if something just beyond the trees were taking stock of our movement. When I looked up, the forest seemed closer than it had the day before, the trunks standing tighter. Together, the space between them reduced. Pike set the order of travel himself. He took the front with his axe in hand, 2 men to a sled. No one straying, no one falling behind. He said we would keep moving until we reached open ground and would not stop for anything, short of a broken runner or a fallen man, when the line started forward. The sound of the runners on the snow felt loud, too loud, carrying farther than it should have. I found myself glancing back more than once, expecting to see movement between the trunks. Each time, there was nothing, only the trees, patient and still. By the time we reached the edge of the cedar, my shoulders ached from holding tension I couldn't release. We were no longer waiting. Whatever had been circling us now knew we were leaving, and the woods felt alive with the knowledge of it. We had not gone a mile when the tote road tightened between spruce stands and the world turned narrow. On either side, the trees stood close enough that a man could touch bark with each outstretched hand. The snow lay deeper here, drifted into the low places, and the sled runners hissed over it in a steady dragging sound that covered smaller noises. Pike walked ahead with his axe low in his right hand. Baptist kept at his shoulder with a peavy hook. I took the rear of the first sled with Voss at the front, and behind us came the second sled with Eli and Jude. Eeyore drove the oxen in the middle, speaking to them under his breath, keeping the yoke straight. No one talked. Breath steamed. The only sound was wood creaking, runners scraping, and the soft clink of chain. Halfway through the spruce, the led ox balked. Not a slow hesitation, but a hard stop, head lifting, nostrils flaring. Eeyore clicked his tongue and pressed forward, but the animal held. The second ox pulled against the yoke and tried to turn sideways, eyes white. Pike raised his hand for the line to halt. That was when the first shape moved. Came out of the trees on our right, low and fast, crossing the gap between trunks without breaking stride. I saw shoulders first, then arms swinging too long, then the line of a head that sat wrong on the body. It didn't rush like a bear. It moved with intent, direct and practiced, as if it had run this distance before. Pike stepped forward at once, axe coming up. The shape stopped just outside his reach, rising upright in a smooth motion that made my stomach drop. Upright, It stood taller than any man there, shoulders broad and heavy, arms hanging near the knee. It turned its head slightly, listening, and I caught the flash of its eyes flat, pale reflections in the dim light. A second shape broke from the left side of the road, not as tall as the first, but quicker. It cut behind the lead sled and drove straight for the oxen. Eeyore shouted and pulled hard on the reins, trying to keep them steady. The animals surged, yoke pins creaking, traces snapping tight. Then a third moved farther back behind us, stepping into the road like it had been waiting for the line to stop. It was lower at first, almost crouched, and when it raised its head, the doubled call rose out of it in a short burst, not a howl, but a signal. Pike didn't wait. He stepped in and swung. The axe bit into the first creature's shoulder with a heavy, wet sound. It didn't fall. It jerked once, then yanked back, muscles shifting under hide like rope under tension. Pike ripped the blade free and struck again, this time lower, toward the ribs. The creature twisted with a sudden pivot, faster than its size should have allowed, and the second blow glanced, cutting deep but not stopping it. Baptist moved in with his hook and struck the creature across the forearm. The iron teeth tore. A line through fur and flesh, and dark blood spilled onto the snow. The creature made a sound low in the chest and pulled back one step, only one, then came forward again. Behind them, the second creature reached the oxen. Its hands opened and closed with that dry, jointed motion, not paws, not claws raking. Blind, but fingers grabbing for purchase. It set one hand on the sled beam and pushed. The beam cracked with a sharp report. The lead sled lurched sideways, runner digging in, and Vos went down hard on one knee. Eli shouted from the second sled, but his voice was cut off when the third creature lunged toward him. Jude swung his PV spike up like a spear and drove it into the thing's shoulder. The iron sank and the creature recoiled, snapping its head back, then struck Jude across the chest with an arm heavy as a log. Jude flew backward into the snow and lay still for a moment. Air knocked clean out of him. Everything happened at once, then tools clanging, animals bawling, men shouting sharp commands. I dropped the rear handle of the sled and grabbed my PV, stepping forward without thinking. The first creature had Pike pressed, its long arms sweeping out, testing distance, forcing him to keep moving. Pike's face was tight, pale beneath sweat that had no place to form in that cold. He swung again and again, each blow heavy, controlled. The creature took them, not without pain, but without panic. Baptist went down when the creature's hand clamped his shoulder. The fingers dug in hard enough to make his coat bunch. Baptist cried out, and I saw his knees buckle. Pike struck low and buried the axe head into the creature's side. This time it made a choking sound and released Baptist, staggering back 2 steps, blood pouring dark against the snow. OR tried to turn the oxen, but the second creature had them. It snapped its jaws near their faces, not biting, just driving. Fear. The lead ox surged forward, dragging the sled with it, and the trace line snapped with a crack that echoed between the trees. The sled shot ahead at an angle, tools bouncing out into the road. The second creature followed 2 strides, then stopped, as if satisfied it had broken our formation. That was when the third creature went for Eli. Eli had climbed down from the second sled, trying to steady himself. He was older, slower, and his ankle turned under him when the sled shifted. He cried out once and dropped to one knee. The third creature was on him in a breath. It bent low, arms reaching, and Eli's shout cut off into a rough gasp. Voss roared and swung the broken handle of the saw at it like a club. The creature caught the wood in its hands and snapped it clean in half. Voss reached for his belt axe. Fumbling, I moved toward Eli, but the road between us was blocked by bodies and fear. Pike shouted for us to fall back toward the landing, where the trees opened. He backed step by step, axe up, forcing the first creature to hesitate. Baptist staggered to his feet, one arm hanging wrong, blood dark on his coat. Jude got upright, wheezing, eyes wide, trying to find his breath again. The first creature charged out. It came in low and then rose, slamming into Pike with its shoulder. Pike went back, boots sliding, but he stayed on his feet. He drove the axe into its ribs, blade sinking to the haft. The creature twisted, and for a heartbeat its eyes met mine through the steam of breath. There was intent there, not rage. Something measuring. Deciding. Then it ripped itself free. The movement tore the axe loose with a wet pull, and the creature staggered, wounded but not down. Pike lunged forward to finish it, but the second creature struck from the side, catching him across the chest with an arm that hit like a beam. Pike fell hard onto the packed snow and didn't rise right away. That broke us. Voss grabbed Jude by the collar and hauled him back. Baptist stumbled after, clutching his shoulder. Aor tried to keep the last ox from bolting, but the animal tore free and ran, leaving the yoke swinging. The road ahead opened into the landing, a wide stretch of timber stacks and river ice beyond. We ran for it, not in a wild scatter, but in a desperate line, each man keeping the others in sight. Behind us, the doubled call rose again, short, sharp. I looked back once and saw the first creature kneel in the snow, one hand pressed to its side where Pike's blade had cut deep. The blood ran steady, thick and black against the white. The second and third shapes held at the tree line, pacing, not rushing into open ground. They watched us go as if the road out mattered less than the lesson they'd taught. When we reached the landing, we stopped with our backs to the timber stack, breath tearing in and out. Pike lay where he'd fallen, just inside the tree line, and for a moment, I thought he was dead. Then he moved, a low groan, and began to drag himself backward with his elbows, face drawn tight with pain. I ran to him without thinking. Voss followed. Together we got under his arms and hauled him into the open. Pike's coat was torn and dark with blood. His ribs felt wrong under my hand, but he stayed conscious, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the trees. No one cheered. No one spoke. We stood in the open ground with broken sleds behind us, missing men in the timber, and a cold certainty settling into our bones. We had made it out of the trees, but the woods had not let us go clean. We reached the open ground by mid-morning, when the light finally spread wide enough that the trees loosened their hold on us. No one spoke as we went. There was nothing left to say. The forest behind us stood quiet, as if nothing had happened there at all, and that quiet felt heavier than the sounds we'd fled. We did not return for the timber. The sleds were broken, the tools scattered, and some things were better left where they lay. When we reached town, Pike spoke to the company agent alone. I was not present for that talk, but I heard later what was said. Wolves, a bear driven mad by hunger. Bad luck and a hard winter. The agent wrote it down without looking up and did not ask for more. No report was filed beyond what was required. For lost equipment and unpaid wages. No questions followed us home. In those days, men vanished in the woods often enough that explanations were accepted without inspection. It was easier for everyone that way. The families were told little, accidents. Exposure, a body not recovered. The words were chosen carefully and spoken once. No one pressed for detail, and none of us offered it. There was no benefit in spreading what could not be proved and would not be believed. We parted ways soon after. Some went south, some took river work. Pike never returned to the deep woods. As for me, I learned how easily a truth can be buried when it asks too much of the living. What stayed behind in that forest was not only the men we lost, but the silence that followed them, complete, official, and final. I left that country before spring and never worked a winter cut again. Pike survived, though his ribs never set right, and he walked with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. We didn't speak of what happened to outsiders, not to the company men, not to the families who asked why certain names never came back on the pay lists. Wolves were blamed. A bear, someone said. We let those answers stand because they were easier to carry. Years passed. I found other work, farther south, closer to towns where the dark didn't press in so tight. Still, when winter came on hard and the nights stretched long, I found myself listening the way I had in that shanty, waiting without knowing for what dot sometimes. When the wind moves just right through trees stripped bare of leaves, it carries a sound that doesn't belong to any animal I know. It isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. One tone rides beneath another, steady and rough, as if two breaths are being forced through a single throat. When I hear it, my hands tighten without my asking them to, and the cold feels sharper than it should. I don't tell anyone what that sound means. There's no proof left to show, no tracks that last past morning light. But I know what followed. US through the cedar that winter, and I know it didn't end there. Some things don't leave when men do. They only wait.